Yes, good afternoon. So we are now starting our session, on the Arab Spring and its impact on international migration. We are going to have quite a long panel. We are supposed to have 2 hours and a half, and we were meant to be 10 speakers. 2 of them are excused. Madeleine Serban from the European Training Foundation will not come, and Nadia Marzouki from the European University Institute will not come. But we are 8 people, which is quite a big group of people to present. So I will introduce this session, and then I was wondering who should come first, but I think that there is an order which is the alphabetical order, which is extremely convenient. So I would just suggest that we follow the alphabetical order, unless Christine, who will present on Europe and the reactions of Europe to the Arab Spring, wants to talk last. Okay. So here we are. Much has been written on the Arab Spring. Not much has been written on migration and the Arab Spring, but something was written. This revolts across the entire Arab world, started a year and a half ago now, and clearly they are still continuing. They are not finished. We do not know the end of the story. We are just at the beginning of it, or perhaps in the middle of it. And until now, the political outcomes of the Arab Spring are not clear, and its economic outcomes are not clear as well. So the main determinants of migration are still extremely unclear. The Arab Spring, or revolts in the Arab region, has raised many expectations that a better world was being born in that part of the world, that life would go smoother in this part of the world. But until now, it has brought a very, very unstable situation. What is that impact? What is the impact of that situation on international migration? What is it now, and how can we anticipate what it could be in the near future? So I will start with the first remark, a preliminary remark, that the age groups that we have been seeing in the streets of the capitals of the Arab Spring, in Cairo, in Tunis, in Damascus, in all these cities, in Sana'a, the age groups in the streets are those of potential migrants. They are young people, basically young people. And the reasons that push them on the streets are exactly those that push them abroad. So voicing, which is protesting, demonstrating in the streets on one side, and exiting, which is emigrating on the other side, are 2 responses to the same frustration of young people, to their desire of a better life, of more freedom, and respect also. Respect was a key word in the Arab Spring. Young people who are increasingly educated today, because education has been lengthening a lot in the Arab region, are, as a result of their education, nourishing increasingly high expectations. But their expectations, their aspirations are frustrated. They are frustrated economically by unemployment, and above all by underemployment, by low return to skills and qualifications, and by economic and social hardships. And they are also frustrated politically by authoritarian regimes, by rulers that were or are still ruling. We are ruling for the last 30 years. and that were negating their capacity to act on their own. So the response of young people to their lack of prospects during many years was just renunciation. It was the response of the majority to accept what was their fate, and some of them, a few minority, it would be emigrating, leaving the country. Now it is protesting. It is going to the street. Will protest result in more emigration? That is a big question. You will not find the answer today from this panel. I will now review a number of facts through numbers mainly, but not only numbers. All the numbers I'm going to present, you can find them in the document which was distributed, co-signed by Christine Fandrick and myself. The first fact, I think, which is important, is that the Arab revolts did not bring any tangible changes with regard to labor, with regard to regular migration. It did not result in more migration. Let us look at the period that is immediately preceding the Arab Spring. Between 2001 and 2010, we have the period of probably most intense immigration from Arab countries. It was high immigration from these statistics, from these countries. If we look at the statistics of the OECD countries, we will see that taking the Arab Mediterranean countries, the number of immigrants, the migrant stock in 2001 was 3.5 million. In 2010, it was 5 million. So in 10 years, an increase of 42%. Most of that increase came to the European Union, 91%. So that is the situation just before the Arab Spring. Then the first question can come to our mind: did immigration play any role in the revolts? I don't know, but intuitively you can say that immigration probably did not bring the prosperity that would have reduced the economic determinants of revolts, the economic discontent of the people. The second remark we can make is that perhaps immigration did contribute into what happened, into the political events. But if it did so, it was probably extremely marginal. Of course, we are all aware that a number of opponents returned. They were exiled in Europe or elsewhere, and they returned to their country during the Arab Spring. That is clearly an impact. We can also say that perhaps migrants did contribute to the political, not life, but the political thinking in their country of origin. And here, my idea is that those who came to Europe were not exposed to the same sort of models than those who went to the Gulf states. That some people could bring a democratic model, let us say, back from their countries of immigration, while others could bring a more fundamentalist or Salafist model. That is just a hypothesis. The second question I would like to ask is, can we say that revolts resulted in increasing flows of irregular migration, first of economic migration, because we have seen that before the Arab Spring, we had a period of intense immigration. So what happened during the revolution and since 2011? Very unfortunately, we do not have the statistics that allow to have a clear diagnosis on that. But what we can say is that according to what we know, and what we know is from a limited number of countries, which are the UK, Germany, Italy, and Spain, according to the statistics of these countries, the previous trend in increasing immigration from North Africa and the Middle East just continued in 2011. It was not accelerated, it was not discontinued even by the economic crisis in Europe. So it was business as usual, if we want. All the migrant stocks from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria increased in all these countries. That is the first result between 2010 and 2011. So during the year 2011. But something is very interesting, is that 70%, 72% of the increase in migrant stock in 2011 came from Morocco alone. And Morocco is precisely the country in which uprisings were the most limited. So there is no clear impact of the revolts on regular migration. Now, perhaps there was an impact on irregular migration. And here I just want to again give you some numbers. Perhaps those of you who were living in Italy will remember that a year ago, a large number of migrants came from Tunisia and then from Libya into Italy. They entered irregularly Italy by sea. Their number was more than 42,000 people, and they were coming basically from Tunisia and Libya, but they were from a variety of nationalities. These numbers were extremely high, more than 40,000 people in 2 quarters, compared with the year before, 5,000 in 2010, and the year 2009, 10,000. So it was feared that this could be a precursory of a kind of enormous wave of irregular migrants to Italy and to Southern Europe. I think that we can say not only this did not happen, but there was no big risk that this would happen. And I have, I think, 3 arguments for that. The first one is that most illegal crossings of the Mediterranean took place during the spring of 2011, during a period during which the policies of Tunisia and Libya were completely disorganized, and during which there was absolutely no control of the coast in North Africa. The second point is that many migrants crossing illegally to Italy were not Tunisian or Libyans. They were Africans from other countries. And the third argument is that irregular migration to Italy across the Mediterranean actually peaked in 2011. But if I take not only to Italy, but if I aggregate Italy, Malta, and Spain, then it did not peak in 2011. The peaks were in 1999, 2006, and 2008. Bigger numbers than in 2011. So most probably the surge of irregular migration that was recorded in 2011 was in response to an opportunity, no control at the border, no coastal control in North Africa, more than to a structural change that would have come from the revolts in Tunisia, Libya, and elsewhere. Probably the revolution in North Africa simply rerouted existing flows towards Tunisia and Libya instead of starting from other North African countries. The second fact which I would like to highlight is that if The revolutions in North Africa did not produce any significant change in regular migration. If they produced only a very short-lived surge in irregular migration, they, by contrast, produced an enormous impact on refugee movements, an enormous impact which is a huge refugee crisis, two huge refugee crises. The events in two countries, in Libya and in Syria, resulted into massive displacement of population. During the spring and summer 2011 in Libya, more than 1.1 million people were recorded as leaving the country. They were leaving for Tunisia, for Egypt, for Algeria, Chad, Sudan, and also Italy and Malta. So these people were, let us say, in two groups of people. The first group was composed of Libyans fleeing the war in Libya or fleeing the regime, and their number was estimated at a bit more than 400,000. These people left Libya for a neighboring country, most of them through a land border. So they were sheltered in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Algeria, and they are thought to have returned to Libya after the collapse of the regime. More than 700,000 people were not Libyans, they were migrant workers working in Libya, and these foreign nationals could belong to two categories. On one side, a huge majority probably of ordinary migrant workers coming from many countries around the world, but mostly from Tunisia, Egypt, and certain African countries, and they just returned to their homes. But you had also a known number of people who were not normal migrant workers. They were people who had been fleeing persecution in a country neighboring Libya, like Sudan, like Chad, or a bit further away, like Somalia, Eritrea. These people were not registered as refugees in Libya because Libya is not a signatory of the Geneva Convention, and above all, Libya does not recognize the status of refugee. But they were de facto refugees. These people, we don't know where they are today. A number of them are stuck somewhere, still at the border of Libya. Probably many of them are still in the country, but here there is a clear problem, humanitarian problem with these people. Last point on Libya, the travel for leaving Libya was never an easy matter. People fleeing from Tripoli to Sudan or had a very long travel to do. The important point, I think, that we must not miss, that the most dangerous route out of Libya was the route to Italy, clearly. Out of 25,000 people who crossed to Italy, 1,500 died in the sea. And we have no record of such big numbers of people dying while crossing the Sahara. So here we have a major problem for Europe. The second refugee crisis started a bit later and is still continuing, probably still gaining momentum in Syria. And until now, we do not have a very precise account of how many people left, but according to UNHCR 2 weeks ago, there were 115,000 people. They were all found in neighboring countries, I would say in 3 and only 3 neighboring countries: Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey, no one in Israel, of course. So this is where they were. Most of them were assisted by UNHCR, more than 70,000, but according to UNHCR, more than 40,000 were not assisted by UNHCR, but were dealt with or taken care of by the receiving state and mostly also the local populations. Now I come to the third fact, which is that the migratory consequences of the Arab Spring, of the Arab revolts, have been entirely borne by non-EU countries, and not at all by European countries. 1 million people who fled Libya were sheltered by African neighbors of Libya. And the burden of sheltering these people was borne by mainly two countries, Tunisia and Egypt, during a period during which they were themselves dealing with their own revolution. So that is something which is important. Not only they were dealing with their own revolution, but many reports say that refugees received an incredible solidarity from local populations in Egypt and in Tunisia, and also from the military and from what was left of state administrations. The same story is now repeating itself in Syria, and it is almost the same story, but in a different context. Turkey is well organized, it seems, to shelter refugees. The government is doing a lot in Turkey. In Jordan and in Lebanon, it is more difficult. UNHCR is less present, and the governments are doing less, but the local populations seem to be doing more. So there is solidarity in place in these countries, but the situation can become worrying, in particular in Lebanon. If we consider that the split between the regime and the opponents in Syria is completely reflected by internal splits in Lebanon within the government itself, between pro and anti-Ba'ath party within the Lebanese government, and within the Lebanese population, between communities, between Sunni and Alawi communities. If you consider that already sheltering Syrian refugees has resulted into very serious clashes in the northern Lebanese city of Tripoli, then there are many reasons to be concerned by what's happening in the Middle East today. And I think that this is a very serious matter for the European Union, and I really wish that the European Union can do more for this crisis than it did in the past. So this was my long introduction, and then we are going to continue. I will introduce our speakers. So next will come, I think, Ibrahim Awad. Ibrahim Awad is director of the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at the American University in Cairo. Before that, Ibrahim was the chief of the migration branch at the International Labour Office or organization in Brussels, and he has been working extensively on the topic of migration, in addition to working on many political issues in the Middle East and in Egypt in particular. So Ibrahim, you're welcome to.
Thank you very much. I have been asked to talk about migration and the Arab Spring. In Egypt, I would divert a little bit in the title, and I will use the term of the Arab awakening and migration in Egypt. And I will talk about three issues. First, the attitudes of Egyptians towards migration after the change in the head of the regime in Egypt in February 2011. Then I will talk about the Egyptian political parties and politicians' attitudes towards migration. And finally, I will talk about migration as a foreign policy variable after the changes in Egypt. In dealing with the Egyptian nationals, Egyptian citizens' attitudes, I think we can divide the period from January 2011 to the present day into two periods. There is first the period of euphoria. The period of euphoria is the period that saw mass demonstrations in Cairo and other Egyptian cities, and that resulted in toppling the former president. And I would extend the period of euphoria for probably 2 or 3 additional months until May or June 2011. And then I think there is another period which we may call the period of politics, where the political forces started trying their hands at politics. These were not actors trained to politics. They tried their hands at the political game. So what happened in these two periods? You will find that in the first period, something was quite striking. Egyptians living in countries, in the industrialized countries, in OECD countries, in GCC countries, some of them returned to Egypt, even to take part in street demonstrations. They were part of the protest movement in their diaspora and on their return to Egypt. So there was a clear contribution of the diaspora to revolutionary movement, to the extent that one of the leaders of the revolutionary movement, in fact, was a migrant in Dubai. Not in the industrialized world, was a migrant in Dubai, of course, highly skilled migrant, one of the organizers of an internet social group. So you had this quite interesting contribution and empathy of the Egyptian migration, Egyptian diaspora, with the revolutionary movement. Quite interestingly, these were not either unemployed people or poor people. So these were part of the middle to upper middle class people who started the events in Egypt. And it reflected a sort of self-confidence that existed among Egyptian migration and among the Egyptian population inside the country. But then you had the period of politics. After euphoria, you wake up to the realities of the world, and you wake up to the distribution of forces in society. And you wake up to the economic and political situation that were awaiting you. First, there was the economic situation. The economic situation started to deteriorate. Slowdown in economic activity, sharp drop in tourism revenues. Tourism revenue is the first largest source of foreign exchange in Egypt. And of course, you also had, during this period of politics, you had the consequences of the crisis in the Eurozone. The Eurozone also has an impact on the economic situation in Egypt. The Eurozone is the first economic partner of Egypt, and it's the first source of tourists in Egypt as well. So you had this economic situation which was compounded by the higher and higher demands made by demonstrators, made by trade unions for better conditions of living, for better wages, for better representation. So this put pressure on the state budget, and it put pressure on the balance of account of the country. All of this, of course, created instability. Of course, we have to say, if we talk about migration, that Egyptian migrants behaved according to theory. Remittances rose. In fact, remittances rose in Egypt even in the year that ended in April. Remittances rose considerably in Egypt. So, in addition to the deteriorating economic situation, you had instability, you had a weak state, obviously a weak state, with insecurity, deteriorating manifestations of disintegration in the political system, and all of that, of course, had consequences for the attitudes of Egyptian population towards migration. After the period of euphoria, IOM carried out a survey which showed that intentions to migrate were extremely low. People had this self-confidence. Now, after the protracted period of politics, you had doubts among the population, especially among the young population. So, economy, security, state, and then the future, of course. The youth did not know what the future reserved for them. There was a fear, there still is a fear of conservative political Islamization. Conservative political Islamization, of course, have an impact on the decisions of some highly educated youth from the middle and upper middle class, and of course they have probably more of an incidence, more of a consequence for Egyptian citizens of Coptic religion. Because they, whether this is justified or not, they have what is justified is the fear of possible discrimination if a political system is created that has some features that the secular youth would not like imposed in the country. So you have all of these determinants, which of course resulted in higher intentions to migrate. Higher expressed, I would not say intentions, higher expressed wishes to migrate, because I am one who does not really believe in the polls and the surveys about whether you want to migrate. Of course, if I ask all of the room here, we probably all will say we want to migrate. Oh yes, to Fiesole Bella says. So I'm not a believer in these surveys. However, there are wishes to migrate, and of course the highly educated were very conscious of demand for the skills in industrialized countries. They knew that their skills are in demand, so they expressed the wish to migrate to industrialized countries. And here I'm talking in particular about the results of a small study that was carried out, supported by Karim. And then, of course, the young Coptic Egyptians relied not only, probably in their minds, relied not only on the demand for their skills, but they also probably relied on the networks that exist in the diaspora in North America in particular. So the Coptic Egyptians, to the difference of the Muslim Egyptians, can rely on the institution of the church in the diaspora. And this, of course, creates a network that could provide support to potential migrants. Now, there have been reports about a spectacular increase in the number of Coptic Egyptians migrating. I have to say that I have not seen any evidence of this. What I think is that if there is a spectacular increase in arrivals in OECD countries, you would read it in the press, certainly. Yes, there are reports, but to my knowledge, this has not, or evidence has not been brought to support this. This is not to say that the wish to migrate is unjustified. There is, but whether it materializes, whether the fears will materialize or not, this remains to be seen. And as Philippe Fag said, in fact, no fundamental change has taken place in migration patterns. Which leads me to comment on an observation made by Rainer Mütze before the break, before lunch. Rainer expected an increase in migration from the southern Mediterranean countries after the Arab awakening, and he compared this to what happened in Eastern and Central Europe. I think that the comparison does not hold, because Arabs already migrated. Doors were not closed to the Arabs to migrate before that, whereas in Eastern Europe, they were closed, and where gates were open, they migrated. So I think that this does not, and of course the evidence is that this did not happen. Now, I think what I would like to point out also with regard to the period of politics in which we still are, in fact, the behavior of Egyptian migrants in presidential elections. Egyptian migrants participated, not in very large numbers, far from the total number of Egyptian migrants, but they did participate. You had a large majority, a clear majority, let's say, a clear majority for the Islamist candidate in the GCC countries. But strangely enough, you also had majority for the Islamist candidate in some European countries. Why exactly? Why is that so? Probably because of adherence to democratic principles. Maybe because democratic principles, especially after the de facto powers took as decisions, this maybe favored the Islamist candidate. But we can also think, or at least express the hypothesis of segregation, of discrimination. This is some sort of reaction to unfavorable conditions of life and work in the countries of destination. This is an assumption that is probably worth researching. With regard to the political parties and the politicians' attitudes, it's very interesting that migration is almost absent from the programs of political parties or the platforms of presidential candidates. In the program, migration is mentioned in three programs, and tangentially at that, not as a specific issues. And you will find an emphasis, in particular, on the protection of Egyptian migrants and on the the rights, the exercise of the rights, which is not very unusual, very strange in political movements that aim at establishing a representative system of government. In fact, when you look at the presidential candidates also, you will see some of them talking about investments, but by Egyptian investors, increasing they do not think of them as migrants, but as Egyptian investors living abroad. Very little is said about mobilizing remittances of migrant workers, which are the second largest source of foreign exchange in Egypt. So, in fact, when they talk about migration, they talk in an uninformed way. They do not really know what they are talking about. So, but they have very large ideas. And when they are asked, some politicians are asked, they think immediately in terms of exploring labor markets for Egyptian workers in Arab countries, in GCC countries, in Libya. Libya comes time and again as a potential very important market for Egyptian workers. But when they talk about protection, and here you can see, this is quite interesting, you see really a concern which was not absent before, but you see a real concern for the protection. And you see, for instance, mentioned specifically protection from the kafala system in the GCC countries. And you see, but this is extended also to protection in Europe. They do not say in Europe, but you understand when you talk that which countries they are talking about. You also have an emphasis on return to help build. To help build a new Egypt. Which in this case, it does not only mean that they are looking for releasing pressures on labor markets, because essentially it is releasing pressures on labor markets that these politicians and political parties look for. I had a few things to say, but probably I will not have the time. However, there is one thing that I would like to mention, which is the third component of my intervention, which is migration as a foreign policy variable. Because they were not very happy with the fall of the former president, you saw the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia taking attitudes threatening, blackmailing with regard to the Egyptian migration. And you saw Egyptian de facto power also catering, trying to tell them, please, this is really some children's play. We are good. We like you. So foreign policy decisions are impacted by migration. With regard to Iran, for instance, Egypt, when it adopts an attitude towards Iran, takes into account Egyptian migration in the Gulf and the attitude of countries that are hosting Egyptian migrants. So migration, of course, it's nothing new. Migration was already a variable in other cases of migration. However, in this case, it's quite interesting, and it affected directly the consequences of Arab awakening. I wanted to bring this up because it is very often disregarded as an important variable in foreign policy making and in decisions on foreign policy. I wanted also to talk about immigrants and refugees into Egypt. I will not have time to do that. I will just say that apart from the crisis in Libya, the movement coming from East Africa, from Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, did not really see a great difference. But this is another story. It is interesting also, but we'll probably have another time to talk about it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ibrahim. Interesting to see that in Egypt, the first impact of the uprisings on migration was return migration from the diaspora. So that's a very interesting point. Now we are going to go to the Maghreb countries. Nous allons parler en français. Donc...
We're going to be speaking in French.
Interpretation from French to English. Donc, je vais maintenant.
So, I'm going to give the floor now, as we are proceeding in alphabetical order, to Hassan Bhubakri. Hassan Bhubakri is from the University of Sousse in Tunisia, where he has been professor since 1986. Professor Bhubakri is extremely well known in the academic world that researches these topics, not just as an academic, mind you, because he is also a member of many committees active in the world of policy making. Hassan is going to tell us about a survey he did together with his team in Tunisia. A survey on opinions and policies and also the events related to migration since the beginning of the revolution in late 2010. Perhaps can you stick to only 15 minutes so that we can have some time left at the end for questions and answers, okay? Thank you. I would like to share with you the results and the considerations done on the basis of the results on the issue of migration after our revolution. I think our revolution should be in quotation marks. I don't know whether we should continue using the phrase Arab Spring either, but basically I would like to highlight three aspects. First of all, the migration flows that were stimulated by the uprising in Tunisia and also in Libya, our neighboring country. And they were very much overlapping, and also on the impact of these migratory flows on the relationships between Tunisia and the European Union and the member states, the ones mostly involved, which were France and Italy. And thirdly, on the impact of these migration flows on the way in which Tunisia manages and administers migration issues, and the evolution that we have detected in this administration. Starting in 2011, there was an unusual migration experience in Tunisia, because Tunisia really ended up with migration flows going in and out, coming and going, and it was also in two stages. The first wave, which was just after the fall of Ben Ali's regime, saw departures of many Tunisians, in particular young Tunisians, not very educated or only with mediocre level of education, and they went towards Italy and particularly towards Lampedusa. 25 to 30,000 until around springtime 2011. The second wave of migration was also made up of lots of different elements, and it broke after the beginning of the war in Libya. So there were several different components, as I was saying. One was the arrival of Tunisian and foreign migrant workers who were escaping from Libya and entered Tunisia. The second component, and this actually is made up of two components: the Tunisians, 60 to 80,000, and another group were the foreigners, around 400,000, who were working in Libya. And then this was, of course, the most important, about 400,000, as I was saying. Between end of February and September 2011, there was about 400,000 of these that were actually counted, and they entered Tunisia from Libya. The second sub-component of this wave, in other words, these were the Libyans who arrived. Libyans, whole families of them. Again, it is estimated that there were about 400,000 of them, who then left Tunisia again around July 2011. And there was about 100,000 members of families. Now, 100,000 members of families were the ones that were registered, but actually 2/3 of the total number were not registered because they returned. Well, there was no visa between Libya and Tunisia. There was a free circulation even at the time of the uprising. Then there was a third category, was the departure of migrant workers towards Italy and Malta. This was mostly sub-Saharan migrants, but also Libyans, Palestinians, Iraqis. And you will ask me, what is the relationship with Tunisia? Well, part of these, until last December at any rate, a part of these migrants had been saved at sea or blocked at sea or were sent back to Tunisia because it was no longer possible for the European authorities to send them back to Libya because Libya was at war. So these are the major categories that we were involved in. And this is why I was saying this was hitherto we'd never unheard of as an experience in addressing migration flows. In the long report, you will get details of the figures which confirm the huge scale of the problems that I'm talking about. But secondly, the other unheard of element was the spontaneous reaction of the local populations and of the burgeoning civil society organizations at the time, and how they welcomed and took over and cared for and fed and sheltered hundreds of thousands of people. At the beginning, especially during the first 10 days, the first 2 weeks, shall we say, the local populations in the south of our country, near the Libyan border, were alone in dealing with this wave of human population arriving. And the international organizations only later arrived and took over. So I want to say that this is extremely important as an element because the disappearance of political control over these civil society organizations allowed them to put to the test their spontaneous abilities and how they were capable of managing this humanitarian emergency. It was incredible. And we haven't yet analyzed it properly to analyze exactly all the logic, the rationales, the way it was organized. But that will be done. Then there's something else. Because this taking in of these refugees by the local populations also showed a possibility for rapid conversion into these. It was a sort of reconversion of the committees for the protection of the revolution. The minute the government had collapsed, these committees, which were part of the regime, and they were made up of the partisans, as it were, the supporters of the old regime, these committees of protection, once things calmed down, transformed themselves into the committee for organizing the taking care of the refugees. It was the same people. So these committees for the protection of the revolution worked day and night over the 10 first days of the arrival of these people in order to provide assistance to the foreign migrant workers and later to the Libyan refugees themselves. I think it's worth studying this more in detail, because I'm sure we will find interesting elements in the generosity, the solidarity, and this sense of brotherhood, of sharing that was expressed. And this taking in of the refugees was also a way of demonstrating that the Tunisian population had emancipated and therefore was capable of taking care of refugees. And that was a message that was being conveyed by the local populations. Then, what is difficult to explain in the survey is the departure of thousands of young Tunisians who abandoned their revolution after having fought it and left Tunisia. Perhaps they had understood that the immediate period after the revolution and the transition period immediately following would not be able to solve the problems that had caused the revolution itself. In other words, unemployment and poverty and inequality. And it seems to me that this situation actually continues today. We're still debating and trying to solve problems of unemployment today. So there are still sit-ins and uprisings which are linked to the inability of the government to address problems related to unemployment. And to meet the needs of the young. So, and this is the second aspect that comes into our survey, is the relationship between Europe and Tunisia. And we spoke about this yesterday with the European Commissioner. I want to go back a bit to how our northern neighbors did not take in our young Tunisians. It was gunboat diplomacy proclaimed by the Italian Interior Minister, who said that he's going to shoot with his cannons, with the Navy's cannons, to ensure that these boats full of migrants do not leave the shores of Tunisia. But the second point was also the effects of the agreement between Tunisia and Italy, which was signed on the 5th of April. And the purpose of that was to issue temporary permits of stay to about 20,000 young Tunisians. But what really surprised here, it was really rather similar to the mentality that the French adopted. The French then refused to allow these Tunisians to enter France. So this gave rise to another debate on the need to revise the Schengen Treaty, to create pillars and new borders and new conditions for the Schengen space. And if a country began to take part in a discussion this kind, well, I think it's still only a discussion or a debate. But at that time, the Europeans were saying, solidarity? Yes, but this solidarity must be offered in the country where the migrant first sets ashore. So basically, the idea was solidarity amongst those countries that can limit the departure of these migrants who have arrived. There is not at all a solidarity in sharing the burden of caring for these migrants at all. And then, of course, there was also a debate which focused on re-establishing frontiers between member states of the Union, even of the Schengen space. And this led the European Commission to propose another framework for managing migration, both within the European Union and also in relationships with Tunisia. So one of the consequences of this migration crisis, shall we say, after the Tunisian uprising, was the proposal last June of a partnership for mobility partnership, which has two main sections. One is to promote mobility between third countries involved and the member states through a package of provisions such as visas, professional migration, and so on. But at the same time, one of the major axes of this mobility partnership is to strengthen the obligations of third countries like Tunis towards European countries in fighting illegal migration, in readmission agreements, and so forth. The problem is this new proposal not really just taking us back to the old principles? And this is a problem in Tunisia as well. And we have noticed that there is overlapping and conflict of competence between different administrations and departments in this mobility partnership. Conflicts of interest and competence between different ministries: Foreign Ministry, Interior Ministry, Human Rights Ministry, Ministry of Justice, Secretary of State for Internal Affairs, and so on. So I think that from this point of view, I think this proposal for the mobility partnership risks actually to demonstrate the inability of Tunisia to do things. I said this yesterday afternoon as well. It also risks to question the real goal of a partnership, which is to act together in partnership. And then one last thing that I'd like to point out, which is the impact of the Libyan uprising and the Tunisian uprising on the question of refugees in Tunisia. Because the question of asylum is really quite important in Tunisia, because we have a refugee camp on the border with Libya, which is managed by UNHCR, and has shown that Tunisia, as a country, as is incapable of handling the problem of these asylum seekers because Tunisia doesn't have sufficient regulations and processes, administrative processes, to handle these people. Thank you for your attention.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Hassan, for all these elements of knowledge that you gave us about Tunisia, migration, and also for your reflection about the fact that there's a newly established leadership that has to manage not only refugees, but also manage foreign policy with European states who are not deeply committed in terms of handling and managing refugees. The full report is on a desk outside this room, and it contains very passionate and exciting details about the negotiations with a new leadership, a regime that is not fully fledged yet. We now move on with Zubir Chatou, who will speak about Morocco. Zubir Chatou is professor at Meknes University in Morocco at the National School of Agriculture. Zubir is specialized in migration and in particular in urban planning issues. And he has an approach that combines both internal and international migration. And Zubir is going to talk about the impact of migratory flows in the Arab world and in Morocco in particular. Starting from the results obtained through a recent survey conducted in Morocco. Please do comply with time limits. You only have 15 minutes. I know it's difficult because you have a wealth of results. The floor to you. Thank you very much. Yes, the Moroccan case is different from the Tunisian one. We have had important changes internally, and we didn't have a revolution, so this is different compared to what happened in Tunisia. But also it is different because during this spring, even if the terminology is contested in Morocco, this spring did not generate migratory flows towards Europe, and there were no boat people going to Spain. So yes, we've had deep changes, also because there was a movement that emerged 2 months after the crisis on December 17th, the 20th of February movement, a movement that is composed, if we want to be simplistic, is composed by Islamists, but also the extreme left wing, but also by NGOs who actually embodied protests for 20 years already, having different claims and so on. And I believe that this gives this movement a specific feature. It is a movement for democracy that claims democracy, but it's not called an Arab Spring movement because it's been in place for 20 years now, and it's been claiming democracy for 2 decades. Secondly, this movement has put forward a number of claims. First of all, extending the democratic space in Morocco, having a new constitution, fighting against corruption, protecting human rights, enforcing justice, and migration was not one of the claims, except at a specific point in time when restrictive measures were adopted by Sarkozy. And since there were NGOs who supported migration strongly, even financially, at that point, some part of the movement expressed claims and tried to fight against the brain drain that we were having. They said, we need our graduates, we need our young people, talented young people. And this is a different way of reacting towards migration compared to other countries. So, So the main feature of this movement after February the 20th is that it extended to all classes, all groups of society. And so the government had to give answers to protesters. And this allowed to manage at best the protests. So migration was never part of the slogans or the claims of this movement, but it was indirectly hinted at and involved in terms of fight against corruption, injustice, hogra, which means humiliation and injustice. And this is something that returns and is frequently mentioned by this movement because it means humiliation, despise, injustice. And we can see it in the internal situation of Morocco. That is to say, Moroccan citizens feel hogra vis-à-vis the political institutions and the public institutions, but also in relation to the north of the world, that is to say, Europe. And this is something that emerged during, for instance, the visa management period when the visa was introduced, and there were claims about visa reciprocity, because the management of a visa creates a relationship of dominance, and people are seen with suspicion, and there is a violation of the principles of circulation of freedom. And there's also discrimination, because with a visa you decide who can live and who cannot live. And this is something that was voiced by this internal movement. That is to say, why do we welcome foreigners in our country much better than how our migrants are welcomed in France, are received in France? This is something that was brought up by the movement and became vocal thanks to this movement. Now, speaking about this protest movement, at a certain point, young people, young researchers, young civil servants that we interviewed thoroughly, they felt that there was this feeling of injustice vis-à-vis Europe. They felt that Europe was selfish towards Moroccans. And through this, there was a criticism leveled towards the way visas were managed and migration was managed. And I think that there was, in a way, an attempt to have their voice heard again by this movement, and in particular by young researchers, young civil servants. Coming to the motivations for migration, there are economic reasons, and this is something that emerged in the interviews, but also different motivations: freedom, democracy, human rights. This is what the interviewees said: transparency, governance, so values that are very often shown off, but are not implemented. And then this is something that it is also linked to the right of circulation. Why should other people be able to come to our country and we're not able to circulate? So there were people who said, I'm against a visa because I don't believe in it. I want to raise again my head. So it was a movement to regain dignity in a way. And this was expressed by the young people we interviewed. And they want to really claim their dignity again. And during this crisis, speaking of migration, well, we can speak about a return migration. We can say it's a return, it's not a return. But with the economic crisis in Spain, with the economic crisis in Italy and in other countries, we see a lot of migrants returning to their home country. But it's not really a return. It's a sort of double presence. They're there, they're here. They are part of a circulation movement. But when they come back, they also have a negative discourse in relation to Europe. And we can see that also on the media, on Moroccan TV, because they are followed up by the media. And there's almost 50% of unemployment in Spain, so they show they can actually give first-hand experience of this negative economic crisis that has repercussions also in Morocco internally. Well, speaking about return migration, it is true, it is politically manipulated and used because the press very often speaks about this issue by saying in October this year 150,000 people are going to come back to our country. And it also tries to change the collective image that people have about migration. And people and the media are starting to say, leave, yes, you can leave, but to go where? So this is how Moroccans started to claim back their own space. Of course, this is contemporary movement, but in general, young people think there's nothing we can do in Europe. There's an economic crisis, there's nothing we can do. And even if we have to migrate, it's better to go to Canada than go to Europe. This is what graduate young people say. So there's also a change in the perception of migration, or rather in the perception of destination countries for potential migrants, for those who, in the imagination of young Moroccans. If we speak about aspirations, for instance, the question of sub-Saharan migrants. This is something that emerged in our interviews, and very often they are taken as a mirror. That is to say, for sub-Saharan people, Morocco's become a destination country where they migrate. There are different reports with different figures. I'm not going to get into the details, but there is some visibility there. So the sub-Saharan migrants have acquired visibility in Morocco. Moroccan people are aware of the fact that they're migrating to their country. They're also spoken about in the media. And the civil society is starting to gain interest in this minority and is trying to put pressure on Morocco in favor of Moroccans who have migrated to other countries in the world. Again, there are claims of the respect for rights and so on and so forth. So, for instance, there was someone who said, well, there was one migrant who died in Madrid and the Ministry for Foreign Affairs didn't even issue a press release. So they're becoming more and more aware of the rights of migrants. And in particular, the militants of the ruling parties are expressing this forcefully. So they understand that the voters abroad are important for the governing parties. And these voters have voted for the change. And they've voted for a break with the past politics. And through voting, they will be recognized by Morocco, because now all political parties in the past were not interested in Moroccan migrants. Now they are. We had interviews with 4 or 5 political parties, and they were not interested in migrants in the past because they didn't vote, so there were no citizens. But now there's a party composed of migrants, but it didn't reach the minimum threshold to be fully accepted as a party at the elections. But Anyway, this is an issue that all the organizations are becoming aware of, and they feel that there must be a dialogue, there must be communication with the Moroccans abroad. So, I will now spend a few words about the relationship between Morocco and Europe, because there's a negative perception by young people in different profiles of young people, researchers, members of political parties, civil servants, and so on. I'm going to quote someone from the Assalama wa Assala party who said that the Arab Spring shook the representation of Maghrebans themselves, and they're not capable, according to which they're not capable to produce any change, except they're only able, according to the past image, to produce migration. But with this movement, they have given evidence that they are able to change things. And this is something that emerged also in other interviews. And I realized that young people know very well how they can become Italian citizens, but they have no knowledge about how naturalization occurs in Morocco. And yet they follow current affairs, they follow foreign channels, and so on. And the same ambiguity was expressed by some other interviewees who said the issue of migration is very often dealt with a security approach and only in terms of demographic or economic phenomenon. This was a researcher who said that. So the idea is that the issue of migration has to be repositioned in the public debate. Even civil servants in different institutions, Moroccan institutions, for instance, the Hassan II Foundation or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who participated in our focus groups, although their declarations are anonymous, but they said that this, that is to say, migration is a topic that deserves a public debate. And this is a way to break with the past in terms of management of migration. In the past, it was managed only by technicians. Now the civil society wants to deal with it. And these were mainly the results of our focus groups and interviews. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Zoubir.
Thank you very much, Zubir. Several points that have come out of your presentation, two in particular. Mobility and circulation are more important, or conceived of as more important than migration. And secondly, return. You concentrate so much on return rather than on migration to begin with. So there's a situation here in Morocco that concentrates exactly on this. Mic is off. Let's turn the microphone off for some reason.
Mic is off.
So Christine Fandrick will now present her paper. Christine is a research assistant here at the Migration Policy Center. Before that, she was working with a resettlement refugee agency in the state of New York. Before that, she was working with IOM Cairo. So you have the floor.
Okay, so as mentioned, the Arab states as well as Turkey played an enormous role in addressing the humanitarian situation after the Arab Spring. So I won't focus too much time on these considerable efforts, but rather I'll focus on the international response and precisely the response of the EU to Arab Spring and migration. And in so doing, I would like to perhaps propose a new approach to a new EU approach to the Southern Mediterranean. And so I'll focus on only 4 points. And the first point is, what was the response? What was the response of the international community, the EU, the United States, And the first response was to address humanitarian needs. And so you saw the EU provide 80.5 million euros to support the humanitarian crisis in North Africa. They also provided about 43 million euros to specifically the Syrian crisis. And likewise, the US spent about $115 million. In regards to refugee resettlement, the EU resettled only less than 700 refugees from the region. And in the United States, in the past 9 months, the US has resettled 528 Syrian refugees, in addition to the 34,000 other refugees that it resettled. And it also provided temporary protective status to Syrians already in the United States. In regards to economic growth, the EU encouraged the European Bank for Resettlement and, for Reconstruction and Development to provide over 5.7 billion euros in loans to the region. And likewise, the United States provided about $1.5 billion worth of loans, but only to Egypt and Tunisia. Also, international military response was the EU and the US and the UN imposed sanctions and arms embargoes on Syria and on Libya, and we all saw the NATO mission in Libya. Finally, the response has focused on democracy promotion, and you've seen this in the Deauville Partnership. That's a partnership with the G8 leaders, Arab leaders, African bank leaders, and this partnership has proposed $20 billion worth of support to economic and democratic transitions in the region. And likewise, the EU and the US has also proposed spending millions of euros and dollars worth to promote democracy. And so this brings me to my second point, and the EU, after the Arab Spring, really viewed the revolutions occurring in the region as an opportunity to promote democracy. And you see this in their communication entitled A Partnership for Democracy and Shared Prosperity with the Southern Mediterranean. And this partnership proposes wholehearted support for democratic transitions. And more specifically, this partnership is a more for more approach. And so the EU will grant more support to countries that reform further and faster. So the further these countries democratically reform, then the more support they can count on from the EU. And on the other hand, it's also a less for less approach, because the less these countries are democratizing, then the less support they will receive from the EU, or their funding will be reallocated. And so, as mentioned, the EU is spending hundreds of millions of euros on this project. And although there has been this heightened focus on democracy within EU policies after the Arab Spring, I think migration policies of the EU and EU member states did not necessarily coincide with, or perhaps were contradictory to, the policy of democracy promotion. And you see this in a couple of policy responses. You see this with Italy in its agreements with the Libyan rebels, the readmission agreements with the NTC. You also see it with Italy's MOU with Italy. This is basically a readmission agreement and training for Libyan police forces, the construction of a center for detention of migrants in Libya, and also you see the EU increasing funding to Tunisia for readmission of migrants and the fight against irregular migration. And so these bilateral and EU agreements were made with interim governments who had not been democratically elected. And were they necessarily democratic? That can be debated. The NTC was essentially a band of rebels, and the Tunisian government was in shambles at the time that the agreement was made. You had the Tunisian cabinet being reshuffled and disbanded, and so these agreements were being made at a time of chaos. The EU is also requiring countries to enter into readmission agreements with in the mobility partnerships, and as people have mentioned, these mobility partnerships are unattractive to Arab leaders at this time. Finally, the EU has encouraged and has opened a regional protection program in North Africa, and this is basically offshored refugee issues, dealing with refugee issues to these countries. And the incentive for the establishment of such a center is that the EU will resettle more refugees. However, as mentioned, they only resettled less than 700 last year. So I would like to ask the question, what is the message being sent to these newly emerging regimes in the southern Mediterranean? So on the one hand, it's okay to enter into agreements with and provide funding to essentially undemocratic regimes for the sake of border control. But on the other hand, the EU has this idea of promoting democracy in the region. And this is really a mixed message. And these are newly emerging regimes who have never managed nation states at a national state level. They've never dealt with foreign policy issues. And so the policy being promoted here is sometimes it's okay to strengthen the border control forces of neighboring states, even if they perhaps use these forces to repress their own citizens. And it's okay to support democracy when it meets your objectives. And I would just like to mention quickly the Hamas election in 2006, where the Hamas was a democratically elected government. However, the EU and other international players decided to defund Hamas, I guess you could say. And so finally, this brings me to my fourth point, and I would like to ask, what are the prospects for democracy after the Arab Spring? And perhaps is there a link between migration and democracy? And I just want to say that just as democracy does not flow from the barrel of a gun, i.e. the Iraq invasion approach, it perhaps does not likewise flow from the opening of wallets. The EU likes to say that it is a leader in promoting democracy. It uses the democratic transitions in Central and Eastern Europe as an example. However, I'm not really sure we can compare the Eastern European, Central European democratization with countries in the Middle East, because if you take the 12 countries that joined the European Union in 2004 and in 2007, and you combine their total populations, it still doesn't equal the number of people you have in Egypt alone, which is 85 million people. And so I'm not really quite sure we can compare the two situations. And also, when democracy is manipulated with monetary benefits, is it really real democracy? And it doesn't necessarily come from the people. So it's highly doubtful that it will last very long. So could there be another way to promote democracy, and is there a link between migration and democracy? If you look at the US, you would say, yes, of course, migrants brought ideas from Europe. They brought ideas from people like Montesquieu and Rousseau and Voltaire and Bayle and John Locke, and they used these ideas in order to build their own democracy. And additionally, so far, research has shown that migrants can be vectors of ideas. They can really bring so-called ideational remittances to their countries of origin. And we would like to perhaps propose the notion that democracy can be an ideational remittance. For example, you see in Morocco, the country with the largest number of migrants in Europe, they have become the most reformed country in the southern Mediterranean, and not to say that it's perfect. However, on the other hand, you see a country like Egypt with the majority of its migrants in the Gulf. And you have also seen Egypt become fundamentalized and perhaps radicalized over time. And so could migration be playing a dynamic here? And are Moroccan migrants from democratic Europe, are they returning to their countries with certain cultural and social values? And on the other hand, are migrants from Wahhabi or Salafi Saudi Arabia returning with such values? And so I want to end by saying that citizens really lose confidence in governments that are unable to provide for basic needs. And so therefore, there's a degree to which a government is able to carry out its functions at any level, let alone be a key of democracy for the country. And so perhaps democracy promotion being promoted by the EU and others right now should be turned into one of development promotion. And perhaps this approach should also allow migration to assist in the development, both through remittances and through ideational remittances.
Done.